All right, greetings and welcome to the segment of today's opening workshop where we get to hear learnings from other states across performance-based regulation. And we're really, grateful and honored to be able to hear from three leading experts from the state of Hawaii. And Hawaii is widely known as one of the leaders in performance-based regulation frameworks across the United States, and have gone through a similar process and effort to both investigate and implement a comprehensive PBR framework for the state. So I'd love to introduce our esteemed speakers on this panel, and I'm going to start with Commissioner Jennifer Potter. Commissioner Potter was appointed to the Public Utilities Commission of Hawaii by Governor Ige in March of 2018 for a term to expire June 30, 2024. And Commissioner Potter was previously a faculty member at the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute. She was an independent research institute within the University of Hawaii, where she conducted research on demand response, DER technology, locational benefits of DER, and energy efficiency. And prior to joining HNEI, Commissioner Potter was a senior scientific engineering associate in the Electricity Market and Policy Group at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, where she was the project lead on the 2025 California Demand Response Potential Study for the California Public Utilities Commission. And during her tenure there, she conducted a number of studies on demand response and integrated demand side management for the U.S. Department of Energy. So thank you so much for joining us today, Commissioner Potter. Next, I'd like to introduce Joe Viola. Joe is the Senior Vice President of Customer Legal and Regulatory Affairs at Hawaiian Electric. And in the beginning of 2022, Joe expanded his executive leadership responsibilities and was promoted to the SVP position. In his previous role as Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Business Strategies, Viola was responsible for all proceedings before the State Public Utilities Commission. His area also included the Pricing Division, which develops advanced rate designs and administers compliance with all existing rate schedules. Joe's responsibilities also included initiatives to support the electrification of transportation and to develop revenues from non-traditional business opportunities. And last but certainly not least, Isaac Morawake. And Isaac is the managing attorney in the Mid-Pacific Regional Office of Earth Justice in Honolulu. And he has extensive experience litigating before federal and state courts and agencies on a range of issues, including water rights, Native Hawaiian rights, shoreline protection, endangered species, environmental health and disclosure, and of course, clean energy. And Isaac graduated from Pomona College in International Relations and from the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii. And after law school, he clerked for Justice Paula A. Nakayama of the Supreme Court of the state of Hawaii. In his free time, Isaac likes to enjoy family, moonlighting in music on bass, or hoping to get back in the water surfing. So thank you, all three of you, for joining us today. It's an incredible opportunity to learn from really national experts in this space, having lived it and experienced it. And so we'll start with Commissioner Potter, just to sort of give us an overview of how Hawaii's experienced performance-based regulation and some of the perspectives of the Commission in that regard. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for having us in part of your consideration and your proceeding, and allowing us to offer some of our experience and knowledge from our proceeding. This proceeding for us, the performance-based regulation proceeding, was the highest priority proceeding for over 2 years for the Commission. We have bifurcated this proceeding into 2 phases. The first phase was really focused on looking at the current regulatory structure and identifying areas that for improvement and areas that might not be working the way that they used to work. So mechanisms that may be outdated, and then identifying also areas of improvement for the utility that we could then create performance incentive mechanisms. So that first phase was completed, and then we moved into phase 2, which really focused on looking at the different types of mechanisms that we could use, identifying the structure of the revenue mechanisms, defining how the PEM mechanisms would work and what they would look like, and ultimately developing or fleshing out the framework that we had developed in phase 1. The staff on our team worked tirelessly. I mean, it was an extreme commitment and contribution from our team to develop staff papers. They developed over 4 staff papers. They had workshops and conferences that we held on a regular basis, and that repeated practice over time, really did require that we had dedicated staff to this proceeding. And in fact, Matt McDonald was actually part of the staff at the very beginning of phase 1 for our team, and it was great to have him there. So it's a great asset for you. So we also, we had stakeholders that came along, and this was really something new to the commission and having such a robust group of stakeholders. We had 18 individuals from 10 organizations that started out with us in phase 1. Those numbers dwindled a little bit in phase 2, but not significantly. And I can't iterate how much work that stakeholders actually had to put forward in this proceeding. So we asked a lot of them in developing their own statements of a position and their own briefings and providing those to the commission for consideration while we refined what that framework would look like and then presenting that back to the stakeholders. So ultimately, we had to start with developing a vision and goals, outcomes, and metrics. And that was really what set the stage for us to be able to proceed into phase 2 and really clearly flesh out the details of this of the framework. So for the utility, one of the benefits that came from this, and one thing that was really important for us and what we recognize, sort of seeing the writing on the wall, is that the current business model of the utility is just not, is breaking down as a result of independent power producers and distributed energy resources. As more and more of the generation is distributed and is taken away from this local centralized utility structure, the utility needs flexibility in order to innovate. It needs to have the ability to think of new ways to produce revenues, and also to even adjust how they are working with DER providers as well as IPP providers. And so they needed revenue certainty, of course, and that was really important in this proceeding. That came from a lot of pressure from the investor community that looked at this and said, hey, is this going to be good for this utility? What is the impact going to be? There was uncertainty there, and the utility really needed to have that confirmation that the revenue stream would be available, it would be provided, and so this proceeding, that financial integrity was a very important part of our proceeding. Also, within that, we wanted to have day 1 savings for customers. That was a very big priority for the commission, and we wanted to basically say, okay, here's this opportunity for the utility to change the way that that they're conducting their business, in particular in O&M, and provide some savings to customers. So, and these are shared benefits in terms of what the commission and what the utility were able to gather, but we really were able to reduce the administrative burden by reducing the number of redundant and duplicate reporting, as well as reducing the number of rate cases that can come in to a 5-year period. We also developed incentive mechanisms that address and align public policy goals with those utility goals. And that really is a win-win situation for both the commission, for the state of Hawaii, and for the utility. And then we also looked at the regulatory framework that could help provide, that would result in drastically less capital investment bias, and so that more focus on solution and service-based solutions. And so those were really what came out of those 2 years. And I have to state, for right now, we're actually back in the trenches again and developing additional performance incentive mechanisms, because this process is not like one and done. Once you get that order out, it's over. There's always room for improvement. There's always opportunity for us to identify areas of improvement for the utility, and then that would align us better with the public policy incentives. So we're still trekking along, but thank you so much, Matt. I appreciate the opportunity to provide those opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Potter. It's a fantastic overview of the Hawaii experience thus far, and I'd love to then turn the microphone over next to Joe Viola. Joe?
Great, thanks, Matt. Thanks, Commissioner Potter. I thought I would take my few minutes to talk about Hawaiian Electric's objectives going into performance-based rate making, and then give you a spoiler alert. I think most of them actually were accomplished with to the credit of the commission and our stakeholders like Isaac. From our view, I agree with what Commissioner Potter said. The traditional utility framework, the utility model, had been developed over 100 years ago, and it really hasn't changed a whole lot, at least in the electric utility industry, for quite a long time. Yet all around us, the world was changing. Our customer expectations are changing. Our state policies were evolving. Our commission's expectations and stakeholder expectations were changing. And frankly, the expectations of ourselves were changing. Yet the model we had was developed back in the day when the most important thing to do was to get heavy infrastructure out to rural areas in the United States and elsewhere. So we actually, this may sound surprising to some, we actually wanted to address the capital bias in the traditional model as well. So much of what is expected of us, so much of what we want to accomplish these days is service-based. And under the traditional regulatory model, the best you can do for services is hopefully get your expenses. You wouldn't get a return on that. And so the framework was really, I say, for a lot of what we wanted to do, what folks expected of us, the traditional model was a disincentive to do those. So we were looking to modernize our regulatory framework to align interests with what was expected of us and what we wanted to do. I want to emphasize that point as well. I think that's a very important objective, to take the time, and I want to compliment the commission on allowing the time for this to happen in phase one, was to take the time to have a discussion with our stakeholders, our commission, our consumer advocate, to redefine what the priority outcomes were. And I think a lot of those would be no surprise to a lot of the folks who are involved in this area, but I think it's a very constructive process to do that. So what we wanted to do was come out of the PBR the phase one and phase two with kind of a renewed alignment on objectives among stakeholders in the commission. I certainly think we accomplished that. I think that was important for public perception as well. I know, folks out there thinking, if you have the wrong model, it's going to produce the wrong results. So while we've started years and years ago on modernizing our resource mix, modernizing our grid, modernizing a lot of things we do, those were not going to be well served with an outdated or older utility model. So we needed to modernize our business model. And to me, business model in this context is our utility framework. And by the way, rate cases, it's I think there's a notion sometimes that the utilities love rate cases. Having gone through 6 or 7 of them myself, I'll tell you you're super labor intensive for everyone involved, the commission, stakeholders, the utility for sure. While they have their pros and cons for sure, they take up resources. They take resources away from the multitude of super important things we want to accomplish. So we were actually on board with having a period of time where we don't have rate cases, or we'll see what happens. But I think there's a tremendous benefit to that if we could accomplish what Commissioner Potter identified, that we would still have certainty and assurance that we could get the funding through revenues to accomplish the things that everyone expects of us and that we want to accomplish ourselves. I think we've done a good job with that. The commission certainly did. Predictability is very important. Rate cases have uncertain outcomes. Under during the multi-year rate plan, people can have their views on whether it's perfect or imperfect or not. At least we have some predictability. I like to say we're living on a fixed income now, but at least I know what my income is going to be the next year. That has a lot of value in terms of planning and being efficient. I kind of know what the fixed revenues are going to be. And then on top of that, it's hard to get by, hard to do great things that we all want to accomplish without some adjustment. You can't do that necessarily in a fixed income. So wanted to make sure that we had a mechanism that would allow for additional investments on things that we all agreed are really important to do, and that was accomplished as well. Last thing I'll mention is we all wanted to spend a lot of time. We knew what the intended consequences were, but we all spent a tremendous amount of time making sure that we explored and tried to identify potential unintended consequences. I think that's critically important. I thought we did a good job on that. The last thing I'm going to mention, kind of an indirect, maybe it's a direct outcome. One of the things I think is the most positive outcomes of the docket, besides the new framework itself, was, I think this, from my perspective, and I'm glad to hear from Isaac as well, I think it improved the relationship with all of our stakeholders. That doesn't mean we'll come out of this seeing eye to eye. I don't actually think that's healthy, actually. The things we're trying to accomplish are haven't been accomplished before. So it's good to have robust civil debate. But I think having, like we did in phase 1, where the commission said the first thing we're going to do is have a comprehensive assessment of our existing framework. What's working? So let's not change something that's working well. What's not working? And how do we adjust for that? I think that allowed for the utility as well as the stakeholders to really kind of sit down and to some extent have the stakeholders walk in our shoes a little bit. Doesn't mean you'll see things the way we see them, but at least you might understand a little better where we're coming from on some things. So I've seen that from my personal perspective. One of the outcomes of this proceeding was we understand each other a little bit better. And I think that pays dividends across so many spectrums. So I'll finish up with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. Those are great remarks and a really insightful lens to what was a really important proceeding for the state. Isaac, I want to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Really impressive. I don't know how I can top that, Joe, but when I hear the utility fully embracing the PBR vision now and the way you just articulated, I'm just thinking alignment. Here we go. I mean, and that's what PBR is about. And it wasn't really that way throughout the proceeding. And I think in the end, it was the commission that showed that leadership and vision. And the utility said, yeah, you know, we see the future here. And now that we've got that framework together, it's great to see that the utilities on board here fully and moving forward. So I don't really have much to add to that initial background. I did want to highlight a couple of things though before, you know, let's dive into some back and forth. First of all, I kind of cringed when I saw you, Matt, reading my webpage bio or whatever, but just to build out a little bit where we were coming from as a stakeholder. Earth Justice is a national clean energy law firm. In this case, we were representing Blue Planet Foundation, which is a leading clean energy advocacy group here in Hawaii. And we partnered with Ron Binns as our expert, who's a former Colorado PUC chair and also a nationally recognized thought leader on utility regulatory reform. It was he actually who was the first person in Hawaii to suggest let's move to PBR, and that was 8 years ago. And so he saw it all the way through, and I think it's really gratifying for him and everyone to be able to close that loop, at least, you know, that initial chapter, and see that you know, PBR framework stood up here in Hawaii. One thing I just wanted to highlight before we get into discussion is that for, I think, a lot of the stakeholders, certainly for Earth Justice and Blue Planet, certainly for the commission, based on their leadership, what they were putting in their orders, where they ended up, this was about transformation, right? And if you're not going to be transformative, then really kind of why you're doing it, and maybe why bother? Because it's a lot of work to stand something like this up. And so initially going into this, it seemed like the initial steps, and Matt, you were there in helping writing the staff reports, but it was this notion of maybe adding some performance incentives onto the existing system. I think it was actually expressed in those terms, layering on PIMs on top of the system. I know Blue Planet was very strong, and the commission ultimately was headed in a certain direction of we want more than that. And just layering on PIMs onto the existing cost of service model, it's been described as driving with a foot on the gas and a foot on the brake at the same time. And in a sense, double paying, right? And so, yeah, you need to transform the fundamentals, which is why I think it was great. It was transformative for the commission to really focus on not just the PIM side, which, you know, every time it seems like these conversations are starting nationally, people jump off on PIMs, but also look at the revenue adjustment mechanisms. I believe that's the terminology we used in Hawaii, and now is also being raised here in this Connecticut proceeding, to break that fundamental link between spending and making money, right? And getting off that cost of service regulation rate case treadmill. And so really credit the commission in leading that fundamental transformation, credit the utility for embracing that. I don't know where Connecticut's at, but I would urge everyone to aim for that transformative impact, go beyond just layering on PIMs, and really get to the heart of shifting from cost of service to a new next generation PBR system.
Fantastic. Oh, thank you all. This is this is a great way to kick things off, both for this discussion as well as for Connecticut's proceeding overall. I think it's great to be able to hear through the three of your experiences, having gone through this journey, what can be realized on the other side. And Isaac, I think you said it so well. It's it's truly transformation in a lot of ways when we talk about modernizing frameworks and reorienting a utility business model for the needs of the power system today, which are certainly very different than 100 years ago. So yeah, let's dive into some questions. I think we spoke a little bit about this already. I'm going to dive into this particular question because I think maybe you could maybe I'll start with you, Isaac. You spoke a little bit about a desire to see some transformation. Could you maybe just dig in a little bit more? As an active participant in the stakeholder community, could you speak a bit to the motivations and conditions that were giving rise to a lot of momentum for performance-based regulation to kick off in the April 2018 timeframe? Now, the Commission's been working on a lot of PBR issues over a number of years, as had the Hawaiian Electric. But in that April of 2018 timeframe, there was legislation that was passed to sort of really underscore the importance of this. And maybe you could speak a bit to the motivations there, and I'll want to hear from Commissioner Potter and Joe as well. But perhaps you could start us off.
Right. You mentioned the legislation, and I understand Connecticut has a similar situation of at least the legislature sounding the call. But really, the move toward PBR, you could probably go back 10 years prior to the PBR proceeding, where that first year, 10 years, sorry, of Hawaii's clean energy movement was really feeling our way, getting early wins on realizing that clean energy is the cheapest solution, way cheaper than fossil fuel. Hawaii had crossed over into that new world. And then having rooftop solar, DERs, just completely take off. And that's legendary already in terms of Hawaii's story and the postcard from the future there. But during that 10 years, there was a growing realization that we had crossed over into that new world where clean energy beats fossil fuels, hands down. And yet we weren't going as far and as fast as we should have been. And so, what's going on? And I keep on thinking of, was that James Carville and the Bill Clinton campaign? It's the incentive, stupid, right? And so I think everyone realized that. And Joe Viola today was seeing that, yeah, all regulation is incentive regulation, and so we were stuck with this legacy system that was dragging us one way while we wanted to go the other. And so it was really the Commission, though, that led the way in sounding the call. Something's got to change. We have to keep up with changing customer expectations and technologies, and that's the legendary, the famous Inclinations white paper that came out in 2014. By the way, you can Google that, and it's still fresh. It's still visionary even today, especially for the rest of the country. And so that was in 2014. Then Nextera happened and all this kind of stuff. But then, yeah, I think there was a growing realization that we needed to change the fundamentals, or else we're going to be stuck in this Einsteinian version of, insanity of doing the same thing and expecting different results. The legislature hopped on board with that legislation that you mentioned, calling explicitly for breaking the direct link between revenues or investments and revenues. By that time, though, the PUC was already poised to open up the docket, and it did shortly thereafter, and we were off to the races.
Thanks. Commissioner Potter, anything to add to Isaac's remark on just sort of the background and sort of motivations that preceded the launch of the initial phase of performance-based regulation in Hawaii?
Yeah, I can't add too much because he did a really great job of covering that.
Agreed.
But I think one of the big underlying concerns has always been the price volatility and the rates, and the legislature certainly was concerned about the impact of fossil fuel price volatility on those rates, and then also recognizing we have the highest rates in the country, and that created for some pretty challenging environment for folks that that aren't necessarily that are low to moderate income, or just even regular income people to pay their bills. It's just a big portion of their income, and is particularly high in Hawaii. So that was certainly a concern, as well as what Isaac mentioned, is that are we getting to where we need to go fast enough? And that is also addressing some of those public policy concerns and those ideas that of where we should be, even though we set the RPS at a specific structure. Should we be going faster? Should we be thinking about this in a different way because the cost of renewables is so much cheaper than that of fossil fuel? How can we improve our system and encourage the utility to basically come along faster than they're incentivized to do so now, or penalized to do so now? So there are multiple components to that, but ultimately, yeah, the commission, as Isaac said, it had already started down this pathway 10 years earlier with decoupling and different mechanisms, the revenue adjustment mechanism, that certainly paved the way for exploring broader areas of I actually say there's performance-based rate making, and then there's performance-based regulation, and the performance-based rate making is really that kind of decoupling the revenue adjustment mechanisms and how we kind of tweak with the revenue streams. And then you have the regulation component that's actually about changing the regulatory structure and looking at internal to the commission and saying what is working and what is not working. And I think that the legislature also identified that the commission had their hands tied, in particular, that they didn't have the necessary tools in order to change the incentive mechanisms or the revenue mechanisms for the utility. And so it really did need to have that mandate from the legislature. That was incredibly helpful in this process, but yeah, the commission had already started down this road years ago. So
great, thank you both. Joe, anything further from the utility perspective? I know Hawaiian Electric had proposed multi-year rate plans and other sort of PBR mechanisms many years in the past, but just want to allow you to add any color or context in the sort of lead up to.
Yeah, sure.
The docket.
I have the greatest respect for my colleague Isaac. He mentioned that Ron Binns kicked this off. I can point to the public record. Hawaiian Electric actually has been a proponent of performance-based regulation back into the 90s. We proposed it in the late 90s. Probably wasn't the right time. It was happening in the telecom industry. Maybe it wasn't the right time. We've been proposing it for quite a long time. And actually, the commission has been, as Commissioner Potter said, has indicated for many years before the legislation was adopted that it was intending to pursue that. We actually, and I know we kind of started from almost the end here. We've had in Hawaii what the commission called a vintage version of performance-based regulation since 2011. We got decoupling back then. We had a multi-year rate plan for each of our utilities and the subsidiaries. We had performance incentive mechanisms. So we started there, but I would agree with everyone that it needed to evolve to something much more modern and much more quickly. So I agree with that. And I do think, going back to what Isaac said, I think I remember during one of the workshops, one of the questions we had was, what would you consider to be truly transformational? And I agree. It was, if we're going to do this, let's really change it. The two things I think, among many things, the two things I think were most transformational about this proceeding were the utility now does have an opportunity to earn a return on providing the services that we want to provide. That's transformational, I think. That's a game changer. And then second, we haven't talked about it a whole lot yet, but I want to hats off to the commission as well for establishing what an innovative pilot framework. Utility and innovation often don't appear in the same sentence, and we kind of recognize that, right? We need to move fast. We need to try new things. The world is developing faster than I think anybody has ever lived through before. So one of the other great outcomes of this docket is the creation of an innovative pilot framework that allow us to propose things. The commission has committed to providing quick review and decisions, and then there's an amount of money that can help us fund trying things that in the past we might feel a little bit concerned about, because if it doesn't work out, you may not get recovery. So I think that's another transformational outcome from this proceeding. That I'm very grateful for that. Thanks.
Hey, Matt, can I add one more tidbit onto that to agree with Joe, and one more thing from Blue Planet's perspective?
Sure.
So along the lines of, yeah, it's about transformation, I really wanted to highlight something that the commission put in its order that to Blue Planet was really at that fundamental level. And it was around this issue of what happens after you do the multi-year rate plan. Yeah, in Hawaii, we had 3 years. We had 3 years. I understand that's where Connecticut is at. Blue Planet pushed for as long a period as possible, 8 for starters, and the commission decided for 5. So we're at 5 now. But what was really key was, what do you do after? And if I could just read directly the commission's visionary ruling here, or a guidance, rather than worry about what will happen at the end of the multi-year rate plan, the company should focus on how to thrive under the PBR framework, regardless of the ultimate duration of the MRP. The expectation should not be that the PBR framework is an experiment that will be abandoned in favor of a return to cost of service regulation at the first challenge. Rather, the expectation is that the commission will work with the companies and stakeholders to modify the PBR framework over time to support its continued longevity and success. So those were words buried in a very, very lengthy order, but to Blue Planet, certainly for me, having lived through this decade plus of trying to push, and we're still going, that signaled at the heart of it all, sort of that commitment to transformation, to long-term commitment to a new system, to the paradigm shift. I just wanted to highlight that, among the many positives of what we've been able to accomplish in Hawaii so far.
Thanks, Isaac, and thank you all. Another question for this group: having gone through a proceeding, multi-year proceeding that shares a lot of the same design characteristics as the one that Connecticut is now embarking upon, could you share some reflections on your experience beyond those that you've already mentioned? What were some of the positive proceeding outcomes, from your perspective? Maybe just the process itself we could focus on now, because I think we really highlighted well, what were the key outputs. And maybe what advice would you give somebody, having gone through this, somebody now embarking on this, a stakeholder, commission, or utility, what advice might you impart at the front end of this journey, having lived it once already? And Joe, maybe we can start with you this time.
Sure, thanks. I covered a fair amount. I would say, one of the things the commission kicked off the docket with was, stating, and this might not sound sexy to anybody, but it's the regulatory principle of gradualism. And I think that's actually important. I think, and coupled with what Commissioner Powder mentioned, I thought it was pretty innovative to bring in our workshops the financial community to actually give their views. Again, we're a private company. If we can't get the investments, we can't do what we need to do and what folks want us to do. So I thought that was really important to have the financial community, the debt and equity folks come in and state what, how they're going to judge the outcome of this. So I thought that was really important. I thought, setting up, we all know going into this, none of us knows the future. So I think spending a fair amount of time kind of identifying, well, what happens if things don't work out the way we want one way or the other? So we spent a fair amount of time on a reopener provision. I think it's important. I know there was significance in entitling those mechanisms, reopeners as opposed to off-ramps. It was, if something's going wrong either way, we're going to set up some criteria at the beginning and identify if, for example, earnings or losses are extreme in one way or the other, or potentially if we're getting notice of a potential credit downgrade, which is not good for our customers or the state of Hawaii, actually, that we would get back together and find out what's going on. So I think it is important to have design a framework with some flexibility that way. I want to just comment on one point Isaac made. I know that we had different views on this, and there's no right or wrong, I think. But from the utilities perspective, having some certainty what happens at the end of the multi-year rate plan is important. I've said it before and I'm saying it right now. I don't know that 5 years from now I want to go into a rate case. What if we're doing really well, or what things are working well? I'm not saying we want to do that. But just knowing what happens at the other end can be important. And I'll mention one thing which we haven't talked about a whole lot, but certainly not here today. There's a potential impact to regulatory accounting. And that's an area I am no expert on, but I talk to the experts. There's a potential risk if you don't define what happens at the other end. There could be some risk to whether you can maintain regulatory accounting. Some folks think that's not a bad thing. Maybe you don't need regulatory accounting. There's no right or wrong answer to that. And I don't think there were just pros and cons. So sometimes defining it, we'll have to see. So far, so good, because I think the commission set up a fairly comprehensive framework where our analysts and our auditors are looking, saying they still think that we have a reasonable opportunity to recover our investments. That's really the key to it. So that's why that was important to us. I think that certainly some thought should be given into what happens on the other side. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Joe. Commissioner Potter, anything to add on the lessons, insights for the journey?
Yes, absolutely. I just a quick one, but a really important one. So at the end of this phase 2, when we were preparing or getting ready to prepare or were preparing the decision and order, we had not really fleshed out the PIMs, and so the performance incentive mechanisms. We had spent a great deal of time on the revenue adjustment mechanisms and the annual revenue adjustment, and defining, what the parameters of that would be, and including, the not MPIR anymore, it's EPRM. So basically the capital projects that are exceptional capital projects that should be considered outside of the RF framework. We spent a tremendous amount of time in the second phase going over those revenue adjustment mechanisms. So when it came down to the decision and order at the end, we really didn't have a lot of input from the parties on the PIMs. It was pretty basic and kind of like, yeah, this would be good. And we didn't have scorecards, we didn't have metrics. And so we had like run the clock out, if you will. And so there does need to be some accounting for, the fact that those do need to be developed. And as Isaac said, everyone throws these PIMs out there as like, this is the highest priority, but you have to get the base work done first, which is the revenue adjustment mechanisms, and that's solid, and determine, whether PIMs are going to be part of that revenue stream, or they're going to be on top of that revenue stream, or how you're going to actually, account for that, and then determine what the values for those PIMs are. And that's a lengthy process. So here we were kind of in the 11th hour, and the commission was really drafting this stuff up at ourselves and throwing it out to the parties and saying, please continue this into the next year. And that was I think less than optimal solution. I think we would have liked to kind of put a bow on everything at the end of the year and said, this is complete and done, and we'll move into actually implementing this now. But that wasn't the case, because we just hadn't spent the time there. So.
Thanks, Commissioner. Isaac, your thoughts?
Totally agree, and but I think that highlights the importance of getting that foundation right first, and then if that takes the time, then sure, then we did have to go to round 1.5 with developing the PIMs. The thing that I would highlight there as well is that we're still working on the PIMs. The commission made clear that this is the first round and there's more coming, and it'll be sort of a developmental, sort of iterative process. And the other thing is, even the PIMs that were established in that first round, there weren't super elaborate BCAs connected with those or anything. And so there's a little bit of just let's move, and forward movement is positive movement, and we'll learn by doing. And so I thought that was a real positive, and not getting stuck in that paralysis by analysis sort of loop that I'm not going to name names, but some other states seem to be trapped in right now on the PBR front. I want to highlight that ratings agencies love what we are doing. It was an eye-opener to have a guy from Moody's come in, our initial sort of developmental phase, and straight up say, cost of service regulation leads utilities down the wrong paths. That's their words, not mine. And pointing out the whole problem of spending money to make money, and the bias against non-capital solutions, making the utility less competitive vis-a-vis potential competition, and the whole moral hazard around trackers and all that stuff. All of this familiar if you folks realize that, the need for change. And then making clear from the beginning that PBR correlates with higher credit quality. Again, their words, not ours. And so it was great to get that validation right off the bat, and all the feedback after phase 1, phase 2 from Wall Street has been positive. PBR is credit supportive, and so this is not just smart policy, but it's smart money, right? And one more thing I just want to point out here at this point is that, yeah, I appreciate the utility valuing gradualism, and you could certainly see that as a principle in what the commission did. At the same time, the flip side is transformation, and are we sort of worshiping sacred cows, regulatory sacred cows in any way, and is the system becoming its own self-justification? So, just two examples of that is, for example, the regulatory accounting issue that Joe raised. We've always been doing this way. Oh my gosh, what happens if we have to, we have to depart from that? Well, it's happened in other industries, when they've shifted towards a performance-based system, things like that. One thing that Blue Planet really emphasized, we didn't get all the way as we preferred, but this notion of return on equity, ROE being the measure of profit, the metric for utility success and profit. Why on earth, if we're going to a performance-based system, are we still going to tether that to a profitability metric that explicitly is based on cost of service, right? And so Blue Planet was proposing, like, at least in parallel, let's start developing some other metrics of profitability. So we don't have that anchor in cost of service. We didn't get all the way there, but that's an example, another example of a sacred cow, and holding on to those, in the name of gradualism.
Hey, Matt, can I respond to just one thing? Just I don't disagree with a lot of what Isaac said. I would say on the credit, in the financial community, saying this is gangbusters. I actually think they did embrace the initial decision, but they're going to watch. This is a continuing story, as we would all acknowledge. They want to see how it works out. They like what's set up. They want to see how it works. And the performance incentive mechanism, people can have their views on whether they're important or not. From the utilities perspective, they're very important. That's part of how we're going to get by. And so they want to see and I think that's the most difficult part from my perspective of this proceeding. I think others would agree. Identifying the right metrics and the right measurements on something new, right, is difficult. You want to set it's pretty easy to set metrics on reliability. We've been doing it for 100 years or so. To set metrics relative to certain engagement categories to something new is challenging. Even if all of us, the utility included, is kind of hard. So I think one thing to consider in terms of lessons learned is when setting up incentives, two things actually. One is what I liked what the commission did. It said it was going to do this. The financial community said this is the right way to go. When you're going to have incentives for something new, probably a good idea to have just upside to start and see how they work, right? On things that are more expected kind of core competency, then you can have penalties involved because you should be able to know how to meet those. But I think it's, I think that's a very challenging part. Commissioner PURA talked about that, coming up with performance incentive mechanisms for some of the new things that the emergent technologies, emergent outcomes that we want to achieve. It is difficult. We didn't have a roadmap to operate from. We checked around the country. There are a few examples, but not a whole lot. So we all kind of knew we're going to try these out. And at least for the start, Ed, have a carrot rather than a stick to start. Once that becomes expected performance, then maybe you can add on a stick as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Commissioner Potter, I just want to thank you again for all these comments, and Isaac and Joe as well. I want to thank you all for being trailblazers and really leading the way on these issues, so that other states can learn from your successes and from your challenges, and continue to follow suit where appropriate. I'll just open it up for any sort of final comments before we close this segment. I think it's been really valuable discussion overall. All right. Well, thank you all again. And
I'm sorry.
yeah, go ahead, Isaac.
You can edit this out if you want to.
Sure.
I was going to say one last lesson learned is whether other states can do it a little quicker than Hawaii did, especially since Hawaii blazed those trails.
Sure.
As I mentioned, in some measure, Hawaii took 10 years to get to this point, but the proceeding itself was 3. And I got to believe that the next states that do it can do it more efficiently or faster anyway, in terms of a total time frame. I think all told there were like 8 rounds of briefing, and it was super extensive. By the end of the time, like, we had it all on the table. But maybe the lessons learned there, we can build on them, and if we believe the IPCC, for example, we don't have 10 years to to turn this around. And so, like in the Hawaii case, we weren't the first. More globally, we actually brought in chair of the Alberta Commission from Canada, and they had made that shift 10 years ago. And at this point, I think they're in two or three cycles. And in the same way, I think hopefully the next states that drive forward on this can build on what Hawaii did.
Thank you, Isaac. Mr. Potter, Joe, any final comments? Well, thank you all. I think this is a fantastic discussion, and really appreciate you sharing your insights, your lessons learned, and some of your experiences from Hawaii on the performance-based regulation proceeding and framework. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
for having us, Matt. Appreciate it.